Ringo Starr didn't join the Beatles like a best friend joining a sleepover. He came in as the new guy, the replacement drummer that everyone thought could be replaced again at any time. He kept on smiling when the cameras flashed, even though newspaper writers made fun of him and called him the luckiest drummer in the world. People whispered and wondered if he was really good enough. Even some of the other Beatles treated him like he was just there temporarily, and one sneaky businessman turned their friendship into a huge fight. After staying quiet for so many years, Ringo has finally talked about the people he could never forgive. And believe me, you're going to be surprised when you hear who they are. Ringo's anger didn't start when he was famous in the recording studio. It started way back when he was a sick kid lying in a hospital bed. When Richard Starkey, that's his real name, was growing up in Liverpool during the war, he spent way more time being sick in the hospital than going to school like other kids. First, he got a really bad stomach infection called peritonitis. Then he got a lung disease called tuberculosis. He missed years and years of school, fell way behind all the other children his age, and when he finally got out of the hospital, he was quiet, super shy, and always felt like everyone else was smarter than him. That feeling of not being good enough really mattered later on. When he was in the most famous band on planet Earth, he would always feel like he was the one who didn't know as much as the others. Playing the drums became his way to feel better and forget his problems. In local bands like one called Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, he wasn't the most exciting drummer you'd ever see, but he was really, really steady and reliable. That's exactly why in 1962, when the Beatles decided they needed a better, stronger drummer than the guy they had named Pete Best, they picked up the phone and called Ringo. He walked into the famous EMI recording building thinking he was the hero they needed, and just a few days later, something really embarrassing happened. When they were recording their song Love Me Do, the music producer named George Martin brought in a professional drummer named Andy White because he wasn't totally sure the new guy Ringo was good enough to play on the record. Many, many years later, Ringo admitted that getting replaced like that still hurt his feelings and never really stopped hurting. He even said, "I went through hell personally because George Martin had this Andy White session drummer. I made him apologize every day." That was the first time Ringo felt really bad. He joined the band as the guy who was supposed to save the day, and the very first thing the adults in charge did was quietly replace him on their big song. The newspapers and magazines didn't make things any better for him. Headlines joked that he could only keep the beat going and nothing more. Music critics called him the least talented Beatle, and kept saying over and over that he was just lucky to be standing behind John Lennon and Paul McCartney, the real stars. Imagine it's your first huge hit song as a musician, and the whole story everyone talks about is that you're only there because your friends felt sorry for you. Inside the band, everyone could see who was in charge. John and Paul wrote all the songs. George was the frustrated third genius who was trying really hard to show everyone how talented he was too. And Ringo, he sang the silly fun songs, played the steady drum beats, made everyone laugh at his jokes, and that was it. Nothing more important than that. And then in 1967, when their manager Brian Epstein suddenly died, the band lost the one person who kept everything calm and organized. That quiet, friendly drummer suddenly found himself stuck in the middle of three super powerful egos fighting with each other. And one of those three Beatles, more than anyone else, made Ringo feel really, really small and unimportant. Paul McCartney, the hard worker who pushed Ringo out. If there's one Beatle who constantly tested Ringo's patience and pushed him to his breaking point, it was definitely Paul McCartney. After Brian Epstein died and left a big empty space, Paul stepped up and took charge of everything. He wrote songs all the time without stopping, organized all their recording sessions, and pushed the other guys to get back in the studio and work when they just wanted to drift apart and take a break. Ringo later described it in a really harsh, simple way. "Paul always made the phone call. Paul would want us to work all the time because he's the workaholic." It sounds like Paul was just being responsible and hardworking, right? But inside the band, it felt more like Paul was trying to control everyone. Paul wasn't just writing songs anymore. He was bossing people around and telling them exactly how to play their own instruments. The moment everything exploded happened during the recording. NG sessions for the White Album in 1968. Paul was obsessing over every tiny little detail, and he kept making Ringo play the same simple drum pattern over and over and over again. Finally, Paul got so frustrated that he actually sat down at the drum kit himself to show Ringo how it should be played the right way. For a drummer who had already been replaced once on Love Me Do, that wasn't just Paul correcting a mistake. It was proof of Ringo's worst fear coming true. You're not really needed, you're optional, we could replace you anytime. Right after that, Ringo just walked out. He left the Beatles completely and disappeared for about 2 whole weeks while the other three tried to keep recording without him. Years and years later, he still talked about how much pain he felt from being treated like a piece of equipment, like a drum machine, instead of being treated as an equal partner and friend. If Paul didn't even trust his drumming skills, then what was Ringo even doing there in the first place? Paul's perfectionism and attention to detail definitely kept the Beatles' music at super high quality and standards, but it also made the other guys feel like they were just hired session musicians playing on their own records. For Ringo, who already carried around the painful reputation of being the replacement and the least talented one, having Paul literally sit down and take his seat at the drums was like watching his absolute worst nightmare come to life right in front of his eyes. And here's where the whole story gets even more twisted and complicated. These two men, Paul and Ringo, eventually became each other's last living connection to the old band. In 2015, Paul stood up on stage at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and personally inducted Ringo as a solo artist, and then he even joked around about inducting him into the hall. In recent years, they've gone on tour together, shared the stage again, and McCartney has even called their bond very special. It's complicated, right? John Lennon and Yoko Ono, when Ringo lost his leader. Of course, you know what comes next. John Lennon and Yoko Ono. The moment Ringo realized his leader was completely gone, nothing upset and confused Ringo more than watching John Lennon slowly disappear and turn into someone he didn't recognize anymore. For so many years, John had been the anchor, the leader holding the band together. Ringo always looked up to him and admired him so much. Even when the other Beatles argued and fought, Ringo would stand behind John's shoulder like a steady, quiet shadow always supporting him. But then in 1968, something changed. At first it was subtle and small, but then it became overwhelming and impossible to ignore. Yoko Ono didn't just show up next to John like a regular girlfriend. She appeared everywhere, in the studio, in the creative process and recording sessions, in all their conversations, and eventually in the unspoken hierarchy and power structure of the whole group. The Beatles had always worked as a closed circle, just the four of them. Four voices, four opinions, and that was it. But suddenly there were five people's presences in the room, and it seemed like only one of them actually mattered to John. The atmosphere and feeling in the studio grew stranger and weirder with every single session. During experimental recordings where they were trying new, unusual sounds, Yoko would interrupt and jump in with her own suggestions about the tone or rhythm of the music. Ringo was stunned and shocked, not by Yoko's boldness and confidence, but by John's reaction to her. Instead of defending his bandmates and sticking up for his old friends, John sided with Yoko instantly every single time. He once looked straight at Ringo and said really bluntly and coldly, "Just keep it even, that's enough." To a drummer who was already carrying around the painful stigma of being called the least talented, that message cut really, really deep into his heart. It basically meant, your opinion ends where her opinion begins, you don't matter as much. The tension and bad feelings escalated and got worse every single time someone questioned or complained about Yoko's presence in the studio. George Harrison once snapped in frustration and said something angry, and John absolutely exploded in rage, slamming his hand on a table and accusing the others of being disrespectful to Yoko. It wasn't about the music anymore at all. It was about loyalty and who John was loyal to. And John's loyalty had completely shifted away from his bandmates. For a peaceful man like Ringo, who valued peace and calmness above almost everything, the emotional cost of all this fighting was absolutely enormous. In his eyes, the Beatles were losing their leader because of an all-consuming, obsessive relationship that left no oxygen or breathing room for anyone else in John's life. He even said later, looking back, that the band was already drifting apart anyway, and Yoko wasn't. The only reasons. And in a rare, absolutely heartbreaking memory that Ringo shared, he described visiting John in New York in 1980, just weeks before John died. They had laughter, they had that old easy feeling between them, and Ringo felt like they were still brothers after all. Just a few weeks later, John was shot and killed. Their complicated mix of love and hatred never had the chance to be talked about and resolved. It vanished and disappeared forever before they could face it together. Alan Klein, the outside businessman who turned the Beatles into enemies. The arrival of a businessman named Alan Klein didn't feel dramatic or scary at first. Actually, it felt like relief, like help had finally arrived. With Brian Epstein dead and their company Apple Corps losing tons and tons of money, the Beatles were drowning in total chaos. They were global superstars and icons who couldn't even balance their own checkbooks and manage their own money. Ringo, who was tired and exhausted from dealing with polished, fancy executives who spoke politely but never actually did anything useful, found Klein refreshing and different. He was blunt, aggressive, and willing to fight hard. He was a man who promised to protect them and get them what they deserved. John was the very first one to embrace Klein and trust him. George quickly followed and agreed, and Ringo, who wanted stability and calmness more than anything else in the world, signed on with them too. He later explained what he liked about Klein. Klein was a hustler, and I felt it was time I had someone hustling for me. But behind all that charm and confidence was a strategic manipulator who knew exactly how to weaponize loyalty and turn friends against each other. Klein studied and watched carefully all the cracks and fractures inside the group. He noticed Paul's need for control, John's restlessness and desire for change, George's resentment and anger at being ignored, and Ringo's desperate desire for peace. Then he exploited all of them, using their weaknesses against them. Meetings that used to just be arguments suddenly became full battlegrounds and war zones. Decisions that used to be unanimous with everyone agreeing became three people versus one person every single time. Within just a few months, Klein had turned their internal tension into a full-scale rupture and complete break. Paul refused to sign a contract with Klein because he didn't trust him. Klein encouraged and pushed John, George, and Ringo to move forward anyway without Paul. Then later in 1970, Paul actually sued the other three Beatles and Klein in court. The lawsuit destroyed and shattered whatever friendship still remained between them. Every wound between Ringo and the others got deeper and deeper. There was distrust, resentment, and regret everywhere. Their brotherhood was completely shattered, not only by big egos, but by legal signatures and courtrooms and lawyers. Then came the cruel, terrible twist in the story. By 1973, Ringo finally realized that the man he trusted, Alan Klein, had actually mismanaged their money and funds, manipulated their contracts to benefit himself, and used the Beatles as leverage to get power and money. Klein was fired and kicked out. Investigations and legal reviews followed. The three Beatles who once sided with Klein, including Ringo, all admitted out loud that they were completely wrong to trust him. A man named Alan Steckler later revealed something devastating and sad that George Harrison once said, "The only way the Beatles can ever get together again is if Alan isn't there. I'm ready, so is Ringo." That confession and admission shows you everything you need to know. For Ringo, Klein represented the deepest, most painful betrayal of all. The man he trusted to protect them and keep them safe became the exact man who made sure they would never, ever stand on a stage together again as a band. When the dust and chaos from Alan Klein finally settled down and ended, Ringo was left standing there facing a brutal, harsh question that had haunted him his whole life. Was he really the least talented Beatle like everyone kept saying? For so many years, he'd heard the jokes over and over, the same mean comments. The drummer who just got lucky. The man who was carried by Lennon and McCartney and didn't do anything himself. And after the breakup, when the band split apart, those hurtful words echoed even louder in his head, because there was no famous band left to hide behind and protect him. But time exposed and revealed the truth that the critics never bothered to see. Those same recording sessions where Paul grabbed his drum seat and where John dismissed him and treated him like he didn't matter were also the exact sessions where music producers realized something important. Ringo was the only Beatle who almost never drifted off tempo or lost the beat. George Martin, the same producer who once replaced him on Love Me Do, later admitted something big. Ringo wasn't just reliable and steady. He was like the click track, the human anchor holding the entire band together and keeping everything in time. And when younger drummers years later studied his drum parts carefully and tried to copy them, they discovered something frustrating. They couldn't copy his feel and groove. It was unique to him. As the years moved forward and passed by, the whole narrative and story flipped completely around. His solo career after the Beatles produced real, actual hits that people loved. And music giants like George Harrison, Eric Clapton, Bob Dylan, and Elton John kept calling him back to play drums on their albums over and over again. They wanted him because his groove and rhythm lifted their music to another level, not because of nostalgia or feeling sorry for him. Because he was genuinely great. Even Paul, the same exact man who once corrected his drumming and sat in his seat, ended up years later inducting Ringo into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist, standing there and praising him. Today, when people talk about Ringo's legacy, it isn't about luck or simplicity anymore. It's about precision, feel, groove, and endurance lasting for so long at such a high level. He wasn't the least talented Beatle at all. He was the heartbeat, the steady foundation that let the other three soar and fly as high as they wanted. And the longer time passes and the more distance we get from those days, the clearer it becomes to everyone. Ringo Starr wasn't the band's weakest link or the one holding them back. He was the piece that no one realized they absolutely needed until he proved it for half a century, 50 whole years of incredible music. So now that you've seen the full picture and heard the whole story, who do you think Ringo resented the most deep down in his heart? Was it Paul, who criticized his drumming? Was it John, who chose Yoko over the band? Or was it Alan Klein, the businessman who destroyed everything? Tell me in the comments whose role in this entire story shocked you the most and explain why. And if you want to hear more brutally honest behind-the-scenes stories, just like this one about rock legends and famous musicians, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. There are so many more secrets still hiding behind those smiling faces on album covers.